Welcome to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, a podcast about the United States and the world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm your host, Michael Patrick Cullinane. Welcome back to the show. We've become accustomed to the idea of trade in the 20th and 21st centuries as being free. Even though that might be the case, we also have many politicians arguing for revised free trade agreements, like Donald Trump's slight refashioning of NAFTA. You might also think of Brexiteers who wanted to take back control from the EU. They believed erroneously that leaving the European bloc would not necessarily mean a redrafting of a trade agreement, but most Brexiteers actually wanted to keep free trade after the divorce. And so, much to their chagrin, the trade agreement took 3 years to rework, and it's still not really to their liking. We're having these debates and these arguments now about free trade, and it's been going on for some time. I mean, you could think back to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in the 1940s, the foundation of the World Trade Organization in the 1990s. The notion of free trade has been the bedrock of globalization. And the resistance to things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, they seem like small protests set against a general consensus that free trade is a good idea. Of course, this wasn't always the case. Britain had long been a champion of the free trade idea. It was an outlier in the 19th century. And what does free trade really mean? The 20th century has seen varying interpretations of this idea in practice. Marc William Palen has been writing about the idea of free trade for more than a decade now, and he joins the show to discuss his latest book, Pax Economica, which seeks to explore the intellectual roots of the idea of free trade, its application, and where the reality of globalization strayed from the intonations of these thinkers. So strap in for a whirlwind ride, because Pax Economica trots the globe with left-wing thinkers from the United States, the UK, Russia, France, Japan, and Germany, among others. And it explores the institutional positions alongside the views of these individuals. It's great to have Marc on the show. He's professor of Imperial and Global History at the University of Exeter in the UK and the author of several outstanding articles on diplomatic history and a wonderful book on the transatlantic economic roots of free trade and Cobdenism called The Conspiracy of Free Trade, the Anglo-American Struggle Over Empire and Economic Globalization. Welcome to the show, Marc.
Oh, thank you for having me.
All right. Well, it's great to see this book out, not least because you and I have talked about it in the past, and your work has done so much to correct many misconceptions that are out there about economic history and thought and international relations. And we're back with a book that is busting assumptions again. But let's start off with the beginning. So your book explores intellectuals who shared a faith in free trade as the basis for world peace. And that's what this book is about. But I was wondering if you could say, who are these thinkers and what brings them all together in the book?
Yeah, I mean, the key, I guess, way of kind of putting them under our umbrella is I keep them within this these intellectual leaders and activists who led the international peace and anti-imperialist movements from the mid-19th century up to as close as I could get to today. And I have to say, I didn't know exactly where that was going to lead when I started this, but the cast of characters became quite broad indeed, but also I thought rather surprising at times. And so one of the key ones that really kickstarts these things, who kickstarts the free trade movement in Britain, and then becomes a leader of the international peace movement, and who I think kind of develops this idea of connecting free trade with peace and anti-imperialism in a very big way, is this guy, Richard Cobden. This British industrialist and politician on the left of the political spectrum in the UK, who also, of course, plays a big part in the first book, but really kind of looking at his influences, ideological and political influences on the peace movement beyond the United States in this case. And some of those are kind of like in the United States, there's Elihu Burritt. In Spain, we've got some really fascinating liberal politicians and economists and educational reformers like Figueroa and Rodriguez. And in Italy, you got Vilfredo Pareto. France, you've got Frederick Bastiat and Frederick Passy, who I think gets the first Nobel Peace Prize ever. so at least at that point, kind of recognized for some of his work. Henry George, who I think has popped up on this podcast quite a bit. David Wells, Edward Atkinson, Clarence Darrow makes a little cameo. Mark Twain, Leo Tolstoy, Sun Yat-sen, J. Hobson, Jane Addams, Roscoe Schwimmer. Anyway, there's the Garrison family is a huge part of this story too, at least from the American side of things. And then you got to get into the kind of international side of the socialist free trade activism. So you got Florence Kelley in the United States, Edvard Bernstein, Karl Kautsky in Germany, some German socialist internationalists like Kagawa and Kirby Page, Scott Nearing. I don't know. Yeah, I can keep going, but it depends on the time and the place. But this kind of the generational development of these activists is a fascinating sort of who's who of people we've probably encountered in previous studies, but not necessarily in the context of their subscription to free trade ideas.
Yes, it's global. I mean, the names you rattled off. I mean, this is not a story about just the United States or Britain, as your first book was really about the transatlantic dimensions of economic thinkers. But this is global, and we've got to come back to Cobden, of course, because he's a big part of this book as sort of one of the big inspirations for this idea. But I think before we get to Cobden, let's dissect that term free trade, because it's I think we all know what it means, kind of, but there are similar terms that are used in frequent parlance that have an entirely different meaning. Words like free market, which you mentioned in your book, but I think equal access is there. Laissez-faire is a term that's been used and bastardized so many times. And perhaps there's words that like just suffer from contextual confusion. Like, you're mentioning there's a temporal element to this, that words mean something different in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. So how do we define the term free trade, and then how does that equate to peace?
So I think probably normally when we think of the term now, we think of it in the context of the 21st century, which is free trade being as close to zero barriers to trade as possible, and this is in part possible that we can have low tariffs in this day and age as we do, and that's because of the growth of direct taxation, the introduction of the income tax in the early 20th century, and other forms of direct taxation that have become the main way that governments can pay for their expenditures, right? But in the 19th century, in the mid 19th century, when this story begins, that's not the case. And so free trade means something somewhat different. It meant tariffs for revenue purposes only, because before these forms of direct taxation, most governments got most of their money from indirect taxation through tariffs, and so free trade meant tariffs for revenue only. That is as low as possible, that you can keep the tariffs while still maintaining government expenditures. And of course, the way this can connect then to the peace activism, even in that sense, is if you can lower government expenditures, if you can lower the costs of, say, standing armies and navies and maintaining colonies, then you can actually make the demands on trade taxes that much lower, which then of course passes on to the consumer in the forms of making food and other necessities much more easily accessible and to obtain. So the connection to hunger prevention, to prosperity, as well as to peace and anti-imperialism. So you can kind of see how, because of the way free trade had this connection to paying for government expenditures, it actually has a really interesting ways of tying into these ideas of peace and anti-imperialism from this left-wing perspective.
And that perspective also has sort of, I don't know, it resonates with some of the ideas that are emerging in the 20th century about democracies as being naturally peaceful. And I know your book doesn't necessarily take up that idea as much as it takes up another idea, which is that free traders believe in supranational institutions. They believe in global governance. They believe in the institutions that foster and provide global governance to manage peace. Does this make the ideas of these thinkers, does it make it divisive? Because it turns off nationalists in many ways. And that can be both, because your book is really complicated, and that's a good thing. I mean, but in your book, you talk about anti-imperial nationalists and imperial nationalists.
Mm.
But does world peace and free trade turn off both groups?
Okay, it's a great question, and maybe we can come back to the democracy connection, because I mean, I suppose you're right. It does connect in certain ways, especially to the anti-colonial nationalists that become a much bigger part of the story from the kind of around 1900 onwards, who see protecting their national sovereignty as a big part of how they understand their idea of nationalism, including economic nationalism as well as political. You know, their way towards independence is tied to the control over their natural resources. So that is certainly going to be a point of contention and tension between the left-wing globalists and the anti-colonial nationalists in various parts of the world. But I do think that the connection between the free trade and peace movement that I'm looking at and the way that they tie it to democracy is really important here too. And maybe if we talk about the suffrage kind of dimensions of this too, that'll come through more clearly. But yeah, as far as the tensions between the nationalists and these internationalists, these cosmopolitans that I'm looking at here, it is rather fascinating. So, I mean, I think one of the ways that this is sort of getting into that historiographical intervention that you mentioned too is correcting these tendencies to associate the late 19th, early 20th centuries with laissez-faire, with free markets, with free trade. And that, to me, that it often subsumes the historiography, both at the national level. The study of empires tends to buy into these tropes, as well as international relations theory. But I think one of the corrections I'm trying to make here is that if you look at it from the left-wing globalist perspective, these leaders of the peace and anti-imperialist movement, this is not how they saw the world. They saw the world order from at least around 1870 onwards as an imperial order dominated by economic nationalist policies at home and abroad. So from these, what I call the imperialism of economic nationalism, right? This is essentially every rival empire except for the British. So you've got the French Empire, the German Empire, the Russian Empire, eventually the Japanese and Ottoman empires, and of course the United States from around 1870 as well, that embrace economic nationalist policies at home and increasingly carve out their own protectionist markets abroad. And this is the scramble for Africa. This is the open door in China at play here, connected with the long depression of the late 19th century. And so, yes, there's going to be some clear tensions between the left-wing globalists seeking to make a more peaceful world, to devolve empires, and those nationalists in this industrializing imperial world system who see the nation state as the pinnacle of capitalist and Western development. And this is the high point for them, and they can't really see an alternative to it. This kind of realist dog-eat-dog world is just something that they struggle to see beyond, in contrast to the left-wing globalists. And so you have those, the imperialists who embrace economic nationalism, who are kind of the big antagonists here. But I also wanted to try to make sense, to a certain extent, though, of those anti-colonial nationalists who also came to embrace economic nationalism, but not as an imperial tool, as an anti-imperial tool. And so you first start seeing this mainly in very rather unusual circumstances in the late 19th, early century. You see them start to take to grow and foster only really in colonial spaces that are under British free trade imperial control, where Britain, the one empire that really embraces these free trade imperial ideas, is coercively enforcing free trade, say in early 1900s Ireland, early 1900s India, Egypt, and around the First World War, where you start to see economic nationalism being more closely associated with anti-imperialism as a way to push back against the free trade dictates coming from Britain. This takes on something very different after 1945, when the global South increasingly is demanding infant industrial protectionism to help it catch up to the Western industrialized world, which had essentially been cheating by keeping the global South down through free market advocacy. Right. So it's this tension between the nationalists who are imperialists and the nationalists who are anti-imperialists that are also a big part of the story.
Oh my goodness, Mark, I don't know where to begin with this, because there is just it's the fine slices here are so fine that, you know, and your book is great for this. It delves into some of these places in greater depth. But you mentioned Ireland, you mentioned the British Anglosphere more generally. Let's just take Ireland for a moment here, and let's try and dissect some of these groups, because you've got left-wing globalists and left-wing nationalists. You've got right-wing globalists and right-wing nationalists. In Ireland, you could be all of those things. I mean, you could be Eamon de Valera, who's arguing for self-sufficiency in the 1930s, and yet is reaching out to the League of Nations to try and justify Ireland's existence on a global stage. I mean, how do you, I mean, I can see the people that you look at as the thinkers here, but how do you distinguish between them and other people that are near them, aligned to them, or, you know, obviously you can see the people that are not like them, but how do you draw the distinctions between people that have very similar ideas?
I mean, one of the ways I try to do as much as possible is to try to connect those ideas and the intellectual histories with the politicians and the political policies that are associated with those ideas, and as directly as I can. So, I mean, the Irish example is a really interesting one. So, if you go back to the mid 19th century, Irish nationalists actually are more closely associated with the free traders, right? So, but this changes by around 1900 when you have the rise of people like Arthur Griffith, who creates the Sinn Féin party, and in fact, I guess maybe another way of tying this in with ideas. I mentioned Richard Cobden. Another big character in the first book, as well as this one, is Friedrich List, the German American political economist, who is sort of the counter to Richard Cobden's cosmopolitan ideas. And it's Friedrich List who, in the mid 19th century, develops these ideas of economic nationalism as an infinite industrial policy for the industrializing world, as well as a necessity for expanding imperially abroad to counteract the more powerful British, right? But there is kind of a dualism to his ideas here, right? It is to thwart the power of the British, so in that sense, it's anti-imperial. But he is very explicitly also saying that the Western industrializing powers also should embrace colonialism as a necessity to capitalist expansion and to the development of the market at home. So it's also very imperial policy. However, people like Arthur Griffith, these anti-colonial nationalists in the colonial world that do embrace these ideas, they focus rather narrowly on the anti-imperial side of his ideas. So Arthur Griffith, when he launches the Sinn Féin party and gives this speech that becomes a pamphlet in 1905, he's explicitly drawing on Friedrich List and saying that this is the guy I believe, and this is who we should all be subscribing to as a counter to see Ireland become the independent nation, just like the Americans did when they embraced Friedrich List's ideas, and just like the Germans and just like the French. And so that's, I thought that's a really useful way. It's always nice when you have a politician like that who is explicitly drawing on these intellectual ideas and undercurrents that I've been looking at. And in a similar way, you could look at the Indian anti-colonial nationalists in the early 1900s, what's called the Swadeshi movement, this grassroots movement of boycotts and other ways of trying to revitalize Indian industries that had been undermined by the British, in a very similar context to the way the Irish are speaking about what happened to them under British rule, right? And again, they look at it a very narrow way, as an anti-imperial tool. But again, other great work like Manu Goswami and others have pointed to. So like one of the Indian nationalist leaders at this time, Sarkar, he actually undertook the first Bengali translation of Friedrich List's nationalism. So you can actually, in many cases, you can actually draw a direct line. And that's what I try to do, is draw a direct line between these ideologies and these intellectual undercurrents and the politicians and activists who take it up.
Yeah, so let me just reiterate and plug away at that, because that is what your work has been so impressive for me, is that we have Richard Cobden and we have Friedrich List, and the two of them shape economic thought all over the world. Obviously, as a student of American history, that's been instrumental to understanding Grover Cleveland and William McKinley, and their ideas. But what I love about this book is that it goes so far beyond that. Pax Economica talks about from Cobden and List to Du Bois to Gandhi to Trump. I mean, so that to me is the big takeaway from this book, is that we can see the follow through. And I'm going to ask you a question about intergenerational thought, but let's go back to democracy just for a moment, because we kicked off this meandering question about the various types of left and right, global and nationalist. But what about that idea of democracy? Is that something that tethers a lot of these thinkers together?
I think so, yeah, and that was one of the kind of these broader connections is one of the things I really spent a lot of time with early on, trying to why was it that all these women suffragists of the early 20th century were involved in all these free trade and peace organizations that I kept finding, and that's what drew me back again to the mid 19th century, where I feel like this is all kind of starting. Mid 19th century is when you have the beginnings of a truly global economic system. I think that's a part of it, but again, it goes back to this free trade movement in Britain that was, yes, it was about making food cheaper by getting rid of the tariffs on grain, and that was obviously politically digestible in a big way to industrializing Britain, where a lot of people were struggling to put food on the table up until that point. But connected to that is why was there a tariff on foreign grain? Why were there the corn laws in the first place? And so according to this left-wing critique, it's to artificially help sustain the aristocratic landed elites, who tend to be militant, who tend to want to go to war, and so they are kind of responsible for the militant geopolitical conflicts of the era and imperial expansion, and why they feel the need to maintain and even expand empires. So the democratic connection here is that if you undermine these protectionist landed aristocratic elites, you undermine their economic power base, you undermine their influence over foreign policy making, and you open the door then to greater democratic growth. So that this is also where the women's suffrage movement is going to come into play too, this connection between peace and anti-imperialism, but also democratization. I think that is such a key part of the left-wing free trade approach here, is that the connection between democracy and free trade for them is very closely entwined. And you can understand that through the tendency of the aristocrats to be associated with the opposite, with protectionism, with monopolies, with imperial expansion.
So how do these ideas spread then? Because in your first book, you talked about Cobden clubs, and I imagine that's part of the story here as well. But how else does the ideas of free trade spread in the golden age? Let's just look at the golden age of peace activism, say, which is often seen as that period before World War One, and maybe a little bit after World War One, until you get the Kellogg-Briand Pact and the outlawry of war. But that's kind of the sweet spot for the peace movement. That's when there's the most people that are going to Lake Mohonk conferences. And how is this message of free trade being spread at that time?
I mean, aside from the sort of usual tools of propaganda, pamphlets, books, stump speaking, and these sorts of things that would have been so common. I mean, this is very much a story of the development of transnational network and using the imperial tools of globalization to undermine empires, or at least that's the idea, to undermine imperialism and war through these new tools, which are also becoming something of a phenomenon, right? The telegraph, the successful landing of the transatlantic telegraph in the late 1860s, the completion of the transcontinental railway in 1869, the opening of Suez, right? A lot of these things are tied to either westward expansion, settler colonialism, maintenance and expansion and connection of the British Empire, for example, in the case of Suez. But these are also tools of communication and the spreading of ideas that the peace movement takes very good advantage of. And so that's why I think partly you can explain the growth of the international peace movement. The way they start working closer together is because the way that they can communicate with one another is becoming something much more efficient and effective through these new tools of globalization. So I think that's key, is their ability to use these tools that are often associated with the expansion and consolidation of empires in the hopes of at least undermining them as well. And so that's a key part of I think the pre-World War I story. And then of course you get the First World War itself, which so we can see the outbreak of World War I, as some tend to portray it as a failure of the international peace movement. But that's not how the peace movement itself saw it. And of course, whenever there's times of war like that, this actually would motivate peace activists to action. So the Mohawk meetings are great up until that point, but you really start to see the consolidation and the growth of a new international peace movement in many ways out of the First World War, which is much more closely associated with this new generation, much more active generation that's associating these ideas also with women's suffrage and how we can use peace and anti-imperial networks to advance the women's suffragist cause, to create democratic equitability in many ways throughout the globe.
How do you think the middle class and the emergence of a middle class helped spread thought like about free trade and peace activism?
I mean, that's a great. I mean, they are by and large middle class. So I think that's certainly at play here, and so the growth of the middle class in that sense is important. I mean, I kind of expected to see a bit more of the grassroots network transcending this, but this is a mostly white middle class movement from its inception in the mid-19th century all the way through. It garners a handful of aristocrats to its cause, and maybe some from the working class, but in that sense too, it maintains that middle class connection there. But so I think that the growth and expansion of the middle class certainly plays its part in ways I hadn't really developed as much in the book, but it's a really good point. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you do develop it to a certain extent, because you do talk about the demographics and the characteristics of these movements, and if we're starting in the 1870s, we have the emergence of Marxism in and around the 1840s, 1850s, and that trickles right through the book. You've got a whole chapter on Marxism, so maybe you could talk to us a little bit about how free trade intersects with Marxism, and then the intellectual offshoots of Marxism that come in later years in the 20th century.
I mean, yeah, the Marxist chapter, I mean, what I try to do with all the chapters is to show that this isn't static. I think that was how I initially kind of thought even it was going to be, but realizing that this is a story of evolution of ideas and policies over time as these movements adapted themselves to this changing global capitalist landscape across the 100 plus years that I look at. Yeah, the Marxist one is a fascinating one, and here's I guess another example of those direct connections you can draw. And I one of the things I try to emphasize here is the hegemonic influence again of British free trade ideas from the mid-19th century onwards, and you can see this in a very direct way on Marx and Engels, who are both living in England in the 1840s at the high point of the British free trade movement, right, culminating in the overturning of the Corn Laws in 1846. Engels, who's living in Manchester, right? Manchester School is another term for Cobdenism, Manchester, England being kind of the hub of this left-wing free trade economic ideology that's taking root. That's where Engels is situated, and he brags about having gone to, I think he says, hundreds of anti-corn law. He must be exaggerating. I can't imagine that the messaging is all that different that you'd have to go hundreds of times. But he's intimately familiar with this middle class free trade movement, and then Marx, when he arrives a little bit later in the 1840s, also establishes himself there. And so I think it's they are there, and these influences affect why Karl Marx then gives a very important speech in Belgium in the late 1840s, in which he says the socialists of the world should be in favor of free trade. And here, I guess, is an important part of the evolution of the socialist subscription to free trade. Marx and Engels are not full-blown subscribers to Manchester liberalism from a socialist perspective, but they do see what Britain has done when Britain turns to free trade in 1846. Marx and Engels, living there at the time, see this as the next small p progressive step towards capitalist development, which thus means it's the next stage towards getting us closer to the proletarian revolution. And so from this more kind of pragmatic rationale, Marx and Engels say that the socialists of the world should be free traders because this is the proper next step of the capitalist stage of development. Of course, this gets really kind of, I think, fascinating, but also complicated once you get to the time of Vladimir Lenin, who's kind of enunciating his theories of imperialism, and Karl Kautsky and Edward Bernstein in Germany. So once you get to this time of the early 1900s, the First World War, socialist subscription to free trade takes on a very new resonance because this is, I mean, if you really read Lenin, as well as Kautsky and Bernstein, these intellectual leaders of socialism in many ways of Europe, they also associate free trade with a more peaceful world in the mid 19th century, but they are able to recognize in ways that Marx and Engels couldn't because of many ways when they are alive, that this isn't how capitalism ended up developed. The capitalists and the socialists don't follow this free trade track. Like I said, from around 1870 onwards, most of the industrializing world turns towards protectionism as part of its prescriptions to the global capitalist crises that they face, and as a way of expanding empires. And so Lenin and all these other socialist theorists of imperialism, much like Hobson at the time too, who Lenin directly borrows from, a non-Marxist in Britain, they see the growth of protectionism, the turn to protectionism from around 1870, the growth of monopoly capitalism, and thus the search for new markets through imperial expansion as all connected, right? So you can start to see there, if you're associating protectionism with the growth of monopolies and the growth of imperial expansion, you can start to see how socialist internationalists increasingly are able to embrace free trade ideas and are able to turn to the speeches and writings of Karl Marx and Engels from the mid-19th century to do so, right? So one of the fascinating things I came across in the American context, at least, is the first English language translation of Marx's speech, where he advocates for why socialists of the world should be free traders. And that was undertaken by a woman in her 20s in Philadelphia named Florence Kelley. And she does so because she wants to influence the great debate of 1888 between the free trader Grover Cleveland and the economic nationalist, the Harrison Republican challenger, and to kind of stick it to her father, who's one of the most diehard protectionists in Congress at the time, William Pickering Kelley. And so she's the one that kind of is responsible. So it's already beginning in the 1880s. You start even in the American context seeing how socialist internationalists are becoming more avowed free traders, and this just picks up a deeper resonance as people at the time are able to see the connections between protectionism and imperial expansion. And again, it's so important to the wider story at play here, but very, very key to understanding how this evolution of Marxist subscriptions to free trade and peace becomes so much stronger as we seep into the early 1900s, when economic nationalism, economic autarky, and imperial retrenchment become the name of the game.
And I just wonder, listening to this about, the application and the idea, is there often a disconnect between, Marx is allowed to just have the idea because he's not Lenin. He doesn't have to apply it. And Lenin, in many ways, too, writes the book on the early Bolshevik Soviet state. But then, when Stalin is there, the economic policy is socialism in one country. It's not spread the message around the world. It's not free trade for everyone. It's let's sort our own house out first. And so how does that play out too? You have the idea and then you have the application, and not all of these thinkers in your book have the opportunity to apply their thought into reality, but some of them do. And how does that play out?
I mean, one of the things I try to do in each of the chapters, to a varying degrees, although it's not the main thrust of most of the chapters, except for chapter 1, which is to explore the nationalist kind of counter narrative to all this. And so even within the Marxist chapter, I felt like I had to take into account the fact that not all socialists were internationalists, right? And there were actually socialists who were quite nationalistic. Socialism for one country, as Stalin will famously make it. That's the Soviet Russia becomes one of those gleaming examples of socialist nationalism by the 1930s, right? I think, and one of the things this allows me to do is to draw out the fact that, in certain contexts in France, in the United States, in Germany, you do have the socialist internationalists like the Berensteins and the Florence Kellys, and the Crystal Eastmans. But you also have them kind of at loggerheads with the socialist nationalists who see socialism as something that should just be applied to one country, and who tend to subscribe to Frederick List's ideas often directly, and who often end up being on the right spectrum of politics, and who end up supporting their nation's imperial aggrandizements and the imperial programs. Right, you even see this in a very interesting way with the split within the Social Democratic Party in Germany. The SPD, the left and right split during the First World War itself, is in many ways this rift between the pro and anti-imperialist segments and pro and anti-war segments.
Well, the liberals in England as well, right? I mean, the Liberal Party in England, it's the same thing.
Absolutely, and of course, there's kind of that sort of opens the way for the Labour Party to become much more influential, and then the Labour Party in Britain ends up embracing in a much bigger way by the 1920s the free trade ideas of the liberals, and sort of merges the liberal ideas of free trade into the Labour Party, the Lib-Lab coalition, as some have called it, right? And in the British context is probably the best. I suppose I should mention that the British socialists are probably, unsurprisingly, the most numerous that subscribe to free trade ideas, the Bertrand Russells, as well as the Labour Party itself, to a certain extent, especially the connection between a more interconnected world and a more peaceful world that the Labour Party maintains to a certain extent, at least up until the 1940s. So again, this tension between the socialist nationalists and the socialist internationalists is an important one here, and it was surprising to me how often, how neatly they tended to kind of fall into the protectionist versus free trade camps as well.
Yeah, I think this is the brilliance of the book, is that it's like a giant Venn diagram of thinkers, and there's all these subplots that they can fit into. Like there's the Georgists and the single taxers, there's the anti-imperialists, the nationalist revolutionaries, the socialists, the religious, because your book covers religious objectors as well. It's this Venn diagram that not any one person inhabits all of, as an idea or as a thinker. And it makes telling the story, I imagine, difficult, but also really rewarding to understand how this all fits together.
It took me a long time to figure out how to structure this book. I'm not going to lie. And because I thought about going, I thought maybe there'd be something useful too, and maybe there still would be, to sort of doing a chronological approach rather than this sort of thematic approach, each chapter covering the 100 years or so between the mid-19th and mid-20th century. But in a way, I felt like it was going to become too unwieldy, as you say, the Venn diagram. Trying to make sense of that. This was the way I came up with so that, sort of to compartmentalize the liberal radicals who were kind of maybe most important to the creation of this movement in the mid-19th century, then followed by the Marxists, and then the women's suffragists who embraced these free trade ideas, and then the Christian left wing peace movement that embraces these free trade ideas, and kind of saving them to the end, because in many ways they are the amalgamation. This Venn diagram is as close as I could get to them all coming together, where you do see the socialists and the liberal radicals and the feminists all kind of coalescing around ideas of Unitarianism and these kind of left-wing versions of Christianity that became so closely associated with the free trade movement. And so it was challenging, it was tricky, but that was the hope too, is that even some of the names are the same in each of the chapters as they appear, but in different contexts. So you've got Jane Addams showing up, of course, as the leader of the women's peace movement of the First World War, but you also see her earlier on in chapter 2 as one of the few female officers of the Anti-Imperialist League that's founded in 1898 within the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. But also her close association during the 1920s and 1930s with these Christian peace organizations, the way that her name keeps popping up. And then, of course, as the Christian peace movement starts overlapping in much greater ways with these other movements, like the Young Women's Christian Association. I did not expect that to be such a big part of this story. And I have to give due credit to the archivist at Smith College, who I was fortunate to spend a month there doing research in the feminist peace collections that they have there, which are amazing. But I gave a talk to the archivist towards the end of my stay there about this, what I was trying to do here, connecting the women's suffrage movement with this peace internationalists of free trade. And one of the archivists came up afterwards and said, you need to look at the Young Women's Christian Association papers. And so then she rolls out these boxes and boxes that are just covered in dust. I feel like, aside from the archives themselves, I might have been the first one to open, and they're just labeled tariff reform. And maybe that's what put people off. But I opened this up, and what I discovered was just this remarkable story of how the Young Women's Christian Association, perhaps the largest women's empowerment organization in the world, how it became involved within the free trade and peace movement. And this is something I'm able to trace out from the 1920s onwards. And the way that this ends up leading to a very close association between the women's peace movement and the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration is very important here too, right? So Cordell Hull, the long-serving Secretary of State under Franklin Roosevelt, he actually gets put in touch with the women's peace movement directly, and they become very close allies for years and years to come. And support Hull's various reforms of trade liberalization reforms and kind of setting the stage for subsequent women's peace and free trade activism after the Second World War.
Okay, so this is probably a good time to talk about intergenerational, the sort of legacy of thought. I mean, I just wanted to say before we move on, because your book does cover feminism and institutional groups like the YMCA or the women's YMCA and things that have been covered by other historians, but I think that's such a telling story. Like Megan Threlkeld covers women peace activists, for example. Ian Terrell covers groups like the YMCA that were influential in peace activism. But what your book does is it finds that box of tariff reform papers in the boxes that Ian and Megan probably looked through and goes, and there's this free trade element to it, which is remarkable, I think, because not only is it adding to our understanding of the scholarship that's out there, but it really rounds out the picture that these ideas, they were not just political in nature, in the strict sense of being political as ideas about policy and democracy. They're also about how we trade, and how we trade is how we interact with one another. So again, I'm just sort of doing the work of plugging your book here, but that's why it's so important for us to understand. But one of the other things that you told me that I found fascinating, and this was before the book came out, was you told me that Cordell Hull was known as the Tennessee Cobden. And he's one of these people that plays an intergenerational role in the story. And so I wanted to give you a chance to say something about that intergenerational intellectualism, because there are several thinkers here that span paradigms, or what we might consider paradigms. So who are they, and why are they so important?
And I guess, yeah, and maybe connecting it to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era in a more explicit way, which is maybe more implicit here, but you're right, intergenerational or the importance of generations is so key here. I mean, I think a lot of the studies that try to make sense of the freer trade system that comes into being during and after the Second World War, I feel like it tends to focus very kind of narrowly on the 1920s and 30s, these kind of intellectual activist and the political movements of the 20s and 30s. And of course, Cordell Hull fits there as a Secretary of State under FDR from 33 on. And but I think one of the points I'm trying to make with this story too, by beginning this story as I do with the mid 19th century and tracing these actors, some of whom actually are the same in the late 19th century, that end up shaping this reformation of the global capitalist system in the mid 20th century. And that is, I don't think you can understand this reformation, this trade liberalization initiatives that we associate with the post 1945 era, this U.S.-led era of freer trade, without understanding the fact that these people who were in charge of those reforms, they came of age in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. So how can you? One of the things I hope is a takeaway here is that to truly understand the reformation of the post 1945 world, you have to understand who these people were and the world that they lived in, and the ideas that they engaged with and subscribed to that were so popular in the late 19th, early 20th century, including Henry Georgism, which is, I think, another one of these really important but neglected ideas nowadays. And so Cordell Hull is a great example here, again, as the kind of Secretary of State responsible for turning the United States from protectionism towards a freer trade policy, beginning in the 1930s with the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, and then helping to set the stage for the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in the late 1940s, which becomes the World Trade Organization in 1995. Cordell Hull, yes, nicknamed the Tennessee Cobden for reasons now that we hopefully can have a better understanding of by tracing the role of Cobdenism on all these free traders that I'm looking at. But he got his political start as a 17-year-old stump speaker for Grover Cleveland during the Great Debate of 1888. And so, and he talks about it in his memoirs about how the First World War itself is also such a transformative event for how he connects the protectionist imperial system and the outbreak of the First World War, and it really entrenches this idea that something more international is necessary to create a more peaceful world. And this is why he's called the Tennessee Column. This is why he's the father of the United Nations, and why he's considered the sort of progenitor of these supranational trade liberalization initiatives like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Right. So again, you can't understand that though without understanding the left-wing globalist story that's unfolding across the 100 years before this.
Absolutely. And your last chapter is as powerful as that story about Cordell Hull, and it reflects the Cobden legacy into the present day. So one of my favorite stories in the book is about Irish businessman Brendan O'Regan, who created the Shannon duty-free zone. So if anyone's ever flown into Ireland and they've not gone to Dublin, chances are they've gone through Shannon, which was this area created. It's called a duty-free zone. And incidentally, just a quick aside, Brendan O'Regan's restaurant in Shannon Airport is responsible for giving the world and the Irish coffee. So that's something we should also celebrate.
Right.
But this free trade ideology that he has, you use O'Regan in the book as a foil for the Washington Consensus, and you also then talk about neoliberalism and neocolonialism as a challenge to that. So how does that friction persist into the 80s, 90s, 2000s?
I really, the Brendan O'Regan duty-free story, and it's and the way that some anti-colonial nationalists like him, which is really what he is, are associating more closely with the anti-imperialism of free trade, is an important part of this post-1945 story, which again, we have to look back to the 100 years preceding that to understand exactly how that can be. But I think, this is another important tension that's at work here in the post-1945 era. So you've got neocolonialism, as Nkrumah famously sort of capitalized in his volume, criticizing this kind of informal economic imperialism of the Western powers, even amidst decolonization, right? Which I think we often associate with, and historians deserve quite a bit of the opprobrium for this too, which is that we associate neocolonialism mostly with free trade imperialism, because the United States becomes the free trade hegemon and becomes an advocate of free trade, at least rhetorically, during this period. That neocolonialism is associated more closely with this. But one of the things I try to point out in this chapter is that if you actually look at the main critics coming from UNCTAD, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, and then the new international economic order that comes into being, their base criticisms of neocolonialism, of Western neocolonialism, is the continued protectionist policies being practiced by the West against the global South that's trying to catch up to the West after decades, even centuries of colonial exploitation. Right? And so there's the rhetoric of the anti-imperialism free trade is very prominent within these global South leaders, these advocates of a new international economic order. At the same time that they're advocating for infant industrial protectionism for themselves as a way to help them catch up, at least temporarily speaking. And this is going to create the tensions then between the NIE, not so much with the left-wing globalist movement, which in many ways has evolved and it allows for and sympathizes with these temporary protectionist demands of the global South, but it creates tensions with this right-wing free trade movement that's picking up steam in such a big way from around the same time, from the 1970s onwards, especially the neoliberal right-wing free trade ideas that are starting to be picked up by Reagan and Thatcher and of course Hayek and the Mont Pelerin Society, as so much great work has been uncovering over recent years and is focused on. But it's the neoliberal right-wing free traders are the ones that are going to be most opposed to the demands of the NIEO. And I think in important ways, very different from the left-wing free trade activism that I'm looking at, although there is some really interesting kind of overlaps there too, or at least there's a shared intellectual tradition that they're drawing upon. But there are some really important differences between the free trade and peace movement from the left-wing side of things and this neoliberal free trade activism and advocacy that's picking up in such a big way from the 1970s onwards. And I think the biggest differences there too, and this is, Cordell Hull was famous for his emphasis on non-interventionism, the good neighbor policy and things like that. But that is another thing that's closely associated with the free trade and peace movement going back to Cobden himself. And that is another key element here is foreign policy, non-interventionism. You should never force our ideas and policies on other people. They should just want to emulate us and our successes is sort of the idea here. Neoliberals are very different in this. So as much as there's a shared kind of tradition of subscribing to free trade and connecting it to peace and integration and supranational governance, a big difference here is that the right-wing neoliberals are quite willing and quite encouraging of military interventionism to make this happen, right? So this is a huge difference between the two. And I think the other one is that where the free trade and peace movements from the mid-19th century on the left side of things saw a very close association with free trade and democratization, the neoliberals increasingly they see democracy as increasingly an impediment to a free trade world. And so they become much more cozy with authoritarians, dictators, right? Think, overthrowing of Allende in Chile and putting in Pinochet as just one of many examples of how they see democracy as an impediment to the creation of free trade worlds. This is very different from the close association with democracy and free trade and peace that the left-wing actors I look at subscribe to.
That brings us into the 21st century, and we're now almost 25 years into the next century, and we have a big election coming up. Actually, not just one, obviously, but the one on my mind is obviously the United States. But I think this year, from what I'm reading, more people will go to the polls than ever before in global history. Since records have been kept since 1800, more people are going to vote for their leaders this year than ever before. And so where does that take us? I mean, where does the left intellectual thought on economic policy, where is it now in 2024?
It's I'd say it's in pretty dire straits. Not to I don't want to end on a pessimistic note, but it's I mean, what I hope is that this, recovering this lost left-wing globalist history will be helpful for informing how the people struggling for a new foreign policy, left foreign policy and left foreign economic policy, as they are right now, might do. I mean, there are some examples. The fair trade movement is something I touched on in the last chapter, which is a really important kind of ethical embraces of globalism, but through regulation, through protections of labor and environment, is something that's still very much there. And I'd say that the fair trade movement has sort of become the mainstay of the remaining left-wing globalists of our age, or perhaps the cooperative movement as well. I think the two of those sort of amalgamated to a certain extent. So the international cooperative movement, the fair trade movement are certainly still there, even if to a certain extent, maybe they've forgotten their own kind of pacifistic lineage and heritage. So that might be useful for them to bring back. But no, I mean, the neoliberal era of the 90s and early 2000s, we're seeing the just desserts, I think, of those policies, of its failures to support and expand democracy. I feel like we're starting to see the very real kind of evidence of how this has been undermining democracy promotion, and not just in the rest of the world, but in the West itself. The United States, Britain, democracy is I feel like in dire straits, even as those two countries seem to be turning to these economic nationalist policies in a big way. That's I think um, rippling around the world amongst right-wing nationalists. And so I think this is going to be an important challenge. Honestly, I think 2016 might have, as far as I can tell, it was the first presidential campaign in the United States where we had two presidential candidates from the major parties both advocating for protectionist policies at the same time. And we're going to see it again. It seems like in the newest round of electioneering here.
But Mark, just to lift the mood a little bit here, because you're right. I don't want to end on a. I mean, one of the things that your book made me think of was that the thought is constantly evolving, and I think you're right that 2016, 2020.
Sorry, yeah.
It is a nadir, right? In terms of like, you know, especially in the United States, but also in the UK as well. Brexit, we saw. I mean, that is definitely repudiation of free trade. You know, the 3 years that followed the vote of the Brexit vote was like, let's see how far we can sink and move away from, you know, relations with the EU and, you know, collaborative ventures on trade and politics. But in the same breath, I wonder, like, it does seem that the thinkers that are out there now are coming up with really interesting ideas about how the new global economy will incorporate some pretty, what I would think are like mainstays of the left now, which is climate change has got to be built into this, right? So green economic reforms, whether it's Green New Deal in the US, whether it's, you know, the green Marxism that's coming out of Japan and intellectual thought in Japan. There's also certainly ideas about global governance that's, you know, how do we transform global governance? So I don't know. I mean, are there green shoots there of a new left emerging? And if so, I mean, I think you could probably say that it comes from not Cobden necessarily, but some of these other, you know, thinkers that your book does discuss.
Yeah, so maybe indirectly. Yeah, I think that you know that's a good point. And green shoots, I like that too. Yeah, and I should correct myself. 2016, of course, we saw the rise of the return of the Republican Party as the party of protectionism under Trump. Hillary Clinton still sort of sticking to the neoliberal kind of trade policies that have become so entrenched. But it's 2020 with Biden that you start to see this against Trump, and we're going to see that showdown again in 2024. So it's really fascinating how in the American context, we're seeing the creation of what I consider a new Washington consensus based around industrial policies and protectionism. And we were talking earlier about the way that this is aligning with labor unions across political spectrums in fascinating ways. But yes, no, to your question about how this might help influence this a new foreign policy for the left, I think is an interesting, because you know, it's not to say I think there's still quite a few socialist nationalists out there who might actually be quite find a lot that they like with the way that the world is turning as far as these ideas and policies are concerned, especially kind of the turn against neoliberalism, which, you know, for understandable reasons has been received a lot of the animus from the left as well as from the right in more recent years. But I guess, yeah, to your point about, I think one of my, as I reflected on it in the very end here in the book is to get us thinking about how would this have looked to the left-wing globalists that my book is concerned with, right? What would they say? And of course, there are handfuls that still, you know, are you know, pockets that still exist out there. I think they would say, you know, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. That you know, the world seemed to be on the right track immediately after the Second World War. Then the Cold War came along and distorted it and created a Manichaean divide between the socialist East and the capitalist West, so to speak, and amongst other things. But the supranational structures, if, you know, administered, you know, effectively and by the right people, you know, the left-wing globalists were increasingly pushed out of positions of power from the 1970s onwards. But if you could, I think that if those sorts of left-wing globalists who can trace the kind of ideological lineages back to what I try to do here, can work within these systems and transform them, reform them from within. Turn the World Trade Organization. I think this is what the people in the book would say is like, reform the World Trade Organization or replace it with something that actually has more teeth. Replace the United Nations with something that has more teeth, much like they were advocating for with the League of Nations before that. If the United Nations is not fit for purpose and the WTO are not fit for purpose for maintaining a more peaceful, less geopolitically conflict-ridden world, then we should replace it with something that can maintain and regulate and uphold those globalist values that they have advocated for so long.
Well, I think the book gives us a great sense of the well springs of contemporary thought, and that's a perfect reason to have you on the show. I mean, the Gilded Age and Progressive Era to the present day. I mean, the connections are, you can't argue about them. They're there, they're real, and if you buy Marc's book, you'll get to read all about how they go from back then to today. So thanks a million, Marc, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Mike.
Well, that's all we have time for. Thanks for listening. You can follow the Gilded Age and Progressive Era on Twitter or on my website, michaelpatrickcullinane.com. Please consider subscribing or reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, because it really makes a big difference and helps direct others to the show. I hope you'll join me again for the next episode.